9 years of solitude had carved Reed Holston into something harder than the Wyoming granite beneath his boots, yet softer than most men would admit, a contradiction that served him well in a territory where survival demanded both strength and mercy. The 2-hour ride to Redstone Crossing should have been routine salt, nails, flour, kerosene, then home before sunset. Instead, he found himself staring at a scene that would haunt lesser men and transform him entirely. An Apache woman stood tied to the hitching post like livestock awaiting slaughter, her deerskin dress torn, feet bloody, dignity intact despite circumstances that would have broken weaker souls. The jeering crowd treated her suffering as entertainment, while the sheriff counted down hours until the coyotes could have her. Reed saw something else entirely a reflection of his own helplessness when fever took his wife and daughter, leaving him alone with grief and endless silence. $5 silver changed everything by evening. That money would either purchase freedom or seal both their fates. But in that moment of decision, Reed Holston discovered that 9 years of isolation had not killed his capacity for love. It had simply been waiting for someone worthy of the risk. Redstone Crossing existed as a scar across the high desert in 1883, where the railroad's promise met reality's harsh mathematics. The town squatted beside alkali water and false hope, populated by men who measured wealth in survival and women who had learned that tomorrow was never guaranteed. Justice wore a badge but answered to whoever paid the most. Mercy was a luxury few could afford. Apache raids had ended officially, but hatred lingered like smoke from burned homesteads, poisoning every interaction between white settlers and the few remaining tribal members who hadn't been shipped to distant reservations. The territorial government's policy was simple: assimilate, relocate, or eliminate. Apache women captured during the final conflicts faced particularly brutal choices: become servants to white families, disappear into brothels, or face execution disguised as accidental death. Law existed primarily to legitimize predetermined outcomes, while frontier justice served those with enough money to purchase their preferred version of morality. Reed Holston had homesteaded his land when hope still felt possible, building a cabin for the family he'd planned to raise with Sarah. Those dreams died in a single week when mountain fever swept through their small settlement like God's wrath, taking his wife and 3-year-old daughter Emma while he watched helplessly. For 9 years, he'd existed rather than lived, maintaining his cattle, working his land, speaking to no one for months at a time. Isolation had become both punishment and protection. He couldn't lose what he refused to love before tragedy reshaped him. Reed had been different, a man who read poetry aloud to his wife, who carved wooden toys for Emma, who believed in building something lasting. War service in Colorado had taught him that life was fragile. Losing his family had taught him it was also meaningless without connection. Yet, beneath layers of protective solitude, the man he'd been still existed, capable of recognizing suffering, compelled to action when faced with injustice, hungry for purpose beyond mere survival. Reed's skills extended beyond ranching. He could track game through 3 counties, read weather patterns like scripture, and handle weapons with deadly precision learned in combat. But his greatest talent was understanding silence, the difference between companionable quiet and crushing loneliness, between chosen solitude and imposed isolation. 9 years of talking only to horses and cattle had made him comfortable with communication that transcended words. Awanada carried different scars, but equal depth. Born to the Chiricahua Apache, she had watched her people's world shrink with each treaty violation, each forced relocation, each family member who disappeared into government schools or military custody. Her sister had been taken 6 months earlier during a raid on their hidden camp. Awanada's capture came when she ventured too close to white settlements, searching for information about her siblings' fate. She possessed skills that white society dismissed, but frontier life demanded: tracking water sources, identifying edible plants, reading terrain for danger signs, surviving on resources others wouldn't recognize. More importantly, she understood that strength sometimes meant endurance rather than resistance, that dignity could survive circumstances that destroyed weaker spirits. That hope was a choice made daily, regardless of external conditions. The central conflict brewing between them went deeper than cultural differences or societal prejudice. Reed feared caring again only to lose everything. Awanada feared trusting someone from the culture that had destroyed her people. Both carried guilt, his for surviving when his family didn't, hers for being captured when her sister remained lost. Their growing connection threatened carefully constructed emotional defenses built over years of necessary numbness. External forces conspired against any relationship they might build: territorial laws that barely recognized Apache people as human, local prejudice that would view their union as betrayal or perversion, and the constant threat of government agents who might reclaim Awanada as escaped property. Their love, if it developed, would exist outside society's protection, vulnerable to legal challenge, social ostracism, and violent interference from those who profited from maintaining racial boundaries. But sometimes the greatest dangers came from within, from the voices that whispered they didn't deserve happiness after so much loss. Reed's decision to pay $5 for Awanada's freedom required no deliberation. Instinct, born from years of regret, moved his hand before conscious thought could interfere. The sheriff's surprise at finding a buyer quickly transformed into calculating greed. $5 for Apache trash? Hell, mister, you could get a decent horse for that money. Reed's silence carried more menace than shouted threats. He counted the coins deliberately, each silver piece ringing against the sheriff's palm like a funeral bell for civilized pretense. Approaching Awanada required different courage than facing armed enemies. She watched him with eyes that held no fear, only assessment, as if measuring whether this white man represented a different kind of danger or a temporary reprieve. When Reed began untying her bonds, she neither helped nor hindered, maintaining dignity that impressed him more than any display of gratitude could have. Her silence spoke volumes. She would endure whatever came next with the same stoic strength that had sustained her through capture and humiliation. The crowd's muttering followed them to Reed's wagon, voices carrying disappointment at being denied their evening's entertainment. "Waste of good money," someone called. "Apache bitch'll cut your throat first chance she gets." Reed helped Awanada into the wagon bed without responding to the taunts. But she noticed how his hand never strayed far from his sidearm, how his eyes scanned the crowd for potential threats. Protection, she realized, flowed in both directions. The 2-hour journey to Reed's ranch passed in loaded silence. Awanada observed everything the route they traveled, landmarks she could use for navigation, the condition of Reed's equipment and horses. Escape remained possible, but something in his careful handling of her injuries, his provision of water without expectation of thanks, suggested motives more complex than the obvious ones. This man carried his own wounds, visible in the careful way he avoided looking directly at her, the practiced loneliness that surrounded him like armor. At his cabin, Reed's actions continued to confuse her expectations. Instead of claiming rights his money had supposedly purchased, he settled her inside with blankets and boiled water, then retreated to give her privacy. Through the window, she watched him tend his horses with the same gentle thoroughness he'd shown her, a man accustomed to caring for vulnerable creatures without expecting reward. The cabin itself told stories of woman's touches in curtain fabric and dish placement, child's toys carved from wood but now gathering dust, photographs turned face down on a mantel. This was a man haunted by his own losses. During the first week, they established unspoken routines. Reed provided food and water, maintained respectful distance, spoke only when necessary. Awanada began tentative exploration, mending her torn dress with needle and thread she found, gathering firewood without being asked, observing his daily patterns. She tested boundaries carefully, noting that he never entered the cabin without knocking, never approached her when she bathed in the creek, never displayed the predatory attention she'd learned to expect from white men. Their first real communication came when Awanada spoke her name while accepting coffee from his hands. The word hung in morning air like a bridge offered across cultural divide. "Reed," he replied simply. And something shifted between them, recognition that they were individuals rather than representatives of warring peoples. Small gestures followed. She washed his clothes without being asked. He brought her wildflowers with her meals. She prepared food the way she'd watched him prefer it. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. Caution evolved into curiosity, survival into something approaching comfort. Reed found himself lingering over meals instead of eating alone in silence. Awanada discovered that not all white men were destroyers. Some were builders, protectors, men capable of gentleness despite carrying capacity for violence. But even as trust began growing between them like desert flowers after rare rain, both understood that the hardest tests lay ahead. As summer deepened into the high desert's brutal heat, Reed and Awanada settled into rhythms that surprised them both with their naturalness. She rose before dawn to prepare coffee the way she'd observed he preferred, strong enough to wake the dead. Sweetened with honey he kept for special occasions that had never come. He began leaving small offerings beside her sleeping area, wildflowers, smooth stones from the creek, once a carved wooden comb that had belonged to his late wife. Neither spoke of these exchanges, but both understood their significance. The first real test of their developing trust came during a violent thunderstorm that turned the creek into a raging torrent and threatened to flood the cabin. Awanada's knowledge of desert weather patterns allowed her to predict the flash flood hours before Reed's experience would have warned him. Working together, they moved his cattle to higher ground, secured equipment, and prepared the cabin for potential evacuation when lightning struck a nearby tree, sending it crashing toward the corral. Awanada's quick warning saved Reed from serious injury. That night, huddled in the cabin while rain hammered the roof, Awanada finally spoke about her capture. "They took my sister first," she said quietly, staring into the fire. "Nayeli. She is 2 years younger. They said she would learn white ways, become civilized. I went looking for her and walked into their trap." Reed listened without interrupting, understanding that her story was a gift requiring careful handling. "Why did you pay for me?" she asked suddenly. Turning to face him directly, Reed studied her features in firelight-high cheekbones, intelligent eyes, strength that hadn't been broken despite everything she'd endured. "Because no one else would," he said simply, "and because I know what it feels like to lose everything and have no one care." The silence that followed held weight of shared understanding. When Awanada kissed him, sudden, tentative, testing Reed's world shifted on its axis. For 3 heartbeats, he remained frozen, then returned the kiss with desperate hunger born from 9 years of emotional starvation. But when she pulled away, he saw uncertainty in her eyes. "You don't have to," he said quietly. "I didn't buy you for that." Her smile transformed her entire face. "I know," she replied. "That's why I choose it." Their relationship evolved with desert flower suddenness. After that breakthrough, Awanada moved her sleeping area closer to Reed's, began sitting beside him during meals, allowed casual touches that sent electricity through both their bodies. Reed discovered that she hummed while working haunting melodies that filled his cabin with music it had never known. She learned that he talked to his horses as if they were confidants, sharing thoughts he'd never spoken aloud to another human being. The practical partnership deepened their emotional connection. Awanada's knowledge of desert plants expanded their food sources beyond Reed's basic supplies. His hunting skills provided protein she transformed into meals that awakened his taste buds from years of utilitarian eating. She began planting a garden using seeds she'd carried in a hidden pouch corn, beans, squash that would grow in high desert conditions where white settlers' crops withered. "What are you planting?" Reed asked one morning, watching her work with soil and water with reverent care. "Hope," she replied without looking up. "My grandmother said gardens are promises to the future. You plant seeds believing tomorrow will come, believing you'll be there to harvest what grows." Reed understood that she was planting more than vegetables. She was putting down roots in his life, making a commitment to staying. But their growing happiness attracted dangerous attention. 3 weeks after the storm, a rider appeared at their ranch, Sam Morrison from Redstone Crossing, claiming legal authority to reclaim escaped tribal property. Awanada was washing clothes by the creek when Morrison arrived. Reed positioned himself between the man and the path to where she worked. "That Apache woman belongs to the territorial government," Morrison declared, showing wrinkled papers that might or might not have been legitimate. "She's classified as tribal prisoner, supposed to be transported to reservation in New Mexico. Can't have her running loose." causing trouble. Reed's hand rested casually on his gun belt. "She's not property," he said quietly, "and she's not causing any trouble." Morrison's laugh held no humor. "You gone soft on Indian flesh." "Holston, that's what folks in town are saying. Man lives alone too long, starts getting ideas about what's acceptable." The insult hung in desert air like smoke from burning buildings. Reed's voice remained level, but his eyes promised violence. "I suggest you ride back to town and tell folks their opinions aren't welcome on my land." The confrontation escalated when Morrison spotted Awanada approaching from the creek. Laundry basket balanced on her hip like any rancher's wife. "There she is," he said, spurring his horse forward. "Come on, squaw. Time to go where you belong." Reed's Colt appeared in his hand with practiced speed. Barrel trained on Morrison's chest. "The lady belongs exactly where she is," Reed said, "and she's not going anywhere she doesn't choose to go." Morrison backed down, faced with certain death. But his parting words carried ominous weight. "This ain't over, Holston. Government's got long arms and longer memories. You can't protect her forever." After he left, Awanada stood beside Reed, watching dust settle on the horizon. "He'll be back," she said quietly. "Men like that always come back." Reed holstered his weapon, noting how naturally she'd used the word lady and how naturally he'd defended her claim to it. That night, lying together under stars that seemed close enough to touch, Awanada asked the question that had been building between them: what do we do if they come back with more men, with official papers? Reed's answer carried the weight of decision already made. We fight, and if we can't win, we run together. The reckoning arrived on a Tuesday morning in late August, when desert heat had baked the ground hard as pottery and mirages danced on distant horizons. 4 riders approached Reed's ranch, led by Morrison, but accompanied now by a territorial marshal whose badge caught sunlight like a warning. Behind them rode 2 men. Reed didn't recognize bounty hunters by the look of their weapons and the predatory way they studied his property. Marshal Davies dismounted with the casual authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Reed Holston, you're harboring a fugitive from territorial justice, Apache woman named—" He consulted papers with theatrical precision. "Awanada, captured during legal military operations, sentenced to relocation and re-education. You will surrender her immediately." Awanada stood in the cabin doorway, but her positioning wasn't accidental. She'd placed herself where she could see all approaches while remaining near the rifle Reed kept loaded beside the door. 9 months together had taught them to think tactically as a unit. "I'm not harboring anyone," Reed replied evenly. "I'm protecting my wife." The lie came easily because it felt like truth. They hadn't spoken vows before any preacher, but their commitment had been sealed in shared silence, mutual protection, and the gradual intertwining of 2 lives that had found completion in each other. Davies laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Apache squaw can't be anybody's wife. Territorial law don't recognize such unions. You've been living in sin with stolen property." "Careful," Reed said quietly, and something in his voice made the bounty hunters shift nervously in their saddles. "You're talking about the woman I love." The words hung in superheated air, Reed's first public declaration of feelings that had grown like desert cacti. Slowly, but with deep roots and fierce resilience. Davies produced shackles, their iron gleaming obscenely in morning light. Woman comes with us. Holston, you can surrender her peaceful, or we can take her fighting. Either way, she's leaving. One of the bounty hunters had begun circling toward the cabin's rear, assuming they could flank and overwhelm through superior numbers. No, Awanada said, stepping fully into the doorway with Reed's rifle cradled in her arms. I choose my own path. Her English, improved through months of conversation with Reed, carried absolute finality. I stay with the man who sees me as human being, not property to be bought and sold. The standoff stretched taut as bowstring, 4 armed men against 2, but Reed and Awanada held defensive positions while their opponents were exposed in open ground. Davies calculated odds and apparently decided negotiation might prove more profitable than bloodshed. Tell you what, Holston, woman's worth $25 bounty to the government. Make it 50 cash, and maybe we forgot where we found her. Reed's fury at the suggestion that Awanada could be purchased and abandoned nearly cost them everything. His hand moved toward his weapon before her quiet voice stopped him. Reed, just his name, spoken with infinite trust, reminding him that acting from anger would get them both killed. She was right. Davies wanted him to escalate to violence, where superior numbers would prevail. You have until sundown to decide, Davies announced, apparently interpreting Reed's hesitation as weakness. After that, we take her anyway, and you get charged with interfering with territorial justice. Think about it, Holston. Is one Apache woman worth losing everything you've built here? After the riders departed, Reed and Awanada faced the impossible mathematics of their situation. Running meant abandoning the ranch Reed had spent 15 years building, leaving behind the only place that held memories of his first family while starting over with nothing. Fighting meant probable death for both of them, even if they survived the initial confrontation. Territorial law would hunt them relentlessly. I won't let them take you, Reed said, packing supplies with grim efficiency. We leave tonight, head north toward Montana Territory, start fresh somewhere they can't find us. Awanada watched him work, seeing how much this decision cost him. Every item he chose to abandon photographs, Emma's toys, Sarah's dishes, represented another piece of his past being sacrificed for their future. You'll lose everything, she said quietly. House, land, cattle, 15 years of work. Reed stopped packing, turned to face her fully. I already lost everything once, he said. Wife, daughter, the life I thought I'd live. Been dead for 9 years until you knocked the dust off my heart. Rather lose property than lose you. But even as they prepared to flee, both understood the brutal reality refugees had no rights, no protection, no certainty of survival. They would become permanent fugitives, always looking over their shoulders, never able to put down roots or build anything lasting. The love they'd discovered might not survive the constant stress of running, hiding, never belonging anywhere. As sunset approached, painting the desert in shades of blood and gold, Reed made a decision that surprised them both. Instead of running, Reed chose to make their stand exactly where they were on the land that had witnessed his first love's death and his second love's birth, surrounded by memories that gave him strength rather than haunting him with ghosts. As Davies and his men approached at sunset, They found Reed and Awanada waiting on the cabin's front porch, positioned like settlers, preparing to defend their homestead from raiders. "Made your choice, Holston," Davies called, his confidence boosted by the additional men he'd recruited in town, 6 riders now instead of 4, armed with rifles and the casual cruelty of men who enjoyed their work. Decided to be sensible about this unfortunate situation. Reed's response came not in words, but in the metallic click of his rifle being cocked. Awanada, positioned beside him with her own weapon, added her voice to his silent declaration, "I choose to stay with my husband." The word hung in desert air like a thrown gauntlet, challenging every assumption about racial boundaries and legal definitions of marriage. "Apache can't marry white," Morrison sneered, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "Territorial law." "Territorial law recognizes common law marriage," Reed interrupted, pulling folded papers from his shirt pocket. "Documented cohabitation, shared property, mutual support. Judge Morrison in Canyon Falls signed the papers yesterday." The lie required enormous faith. There had been no time to ride to Canyon Falls, no judge to sign anything. But Davies couldn't verify the document's authenticity without a 2-day journey, and Reed was betting the marshal wouldn't want to explain to his superiors why he'd started a shooting war over paperwork that might prove legitimate. Davies studied the papers through his spyglass, searching for obvious forgeries while calculating the political consequences of various actions. Killing a white rancher defending his legal wife would create territorial scandal. Backing down would damage his authority. The standoff stretched like a bowstring approaching its breaking point. The moment of crisis came when one of the bounty hunters, frustrated by the delay and eager for his payment, spurred his horse toward the cabin. "Enough talking," he snarled. "I'm taking the squaw." His move triggered everything. Reed's rifle barked, dropping the man from his saddle while Awanada's shot sent another bounty hunter's hat spinning away from his head with inches to spare. "Next one kills," Reed announced calmly, already reloading. Anyone else feeling impatient? The remaining men realized they faced opponents who had chosen their ground carefully, who could reload faster than cavalry charging uphill, who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. Davies made his calculation retreat meant embarrassment, but survival. Advance meant possible victory. At the cost of casualties, he'd have to explain to territorial authorities who preferred their violence to be more subtle. "This isn't over, Holston," he declared, but his withdrawal had already begun. "Paperwork or no paperwork, government's got long memories." "So do I," Reed replied, keeping his rifle trained on the marshal's chest until all riders had disappeared beyond the rise. Only then did he lower his weapon, hand shaking slightly with adrenaline discharge. That night, as they treated the wounded bounty hunter who'd been more foolish than evil, Awanada asked about the papers Reed had shown Davies. "Legal marriage documents," Reed said seriously. "Soon as we can get to Canyon Falls, we'll make them real, if you want to. That is," her kiss provided more definitive answer than any words could have managed. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in Canyon Falls, with Judge Morrison, a different Morrison, thankfully performing a ceremony that was equal parts legal protection and genuine celebration. Awanada wore a dress she'd sewn herself, combining Apache patterns with frontier practicality. Reed wore his only good suit, the one he'd planned to be buried in, but decided he'd rather live in instead. Witnesses included ranchers from neighboring spreads who'd grown to respect Reed's judgment, a few Apache families who'd somehow avoided relocation and who blessed the Union in their own language, and even Sheriff Thompson from Redstone Crossing, who'd decided that official marriage made previous complications disappear into bureaucratic convenience. The ceremony itself was simple vows spoken in English and Apache, rings forged from silver Reed had traded for in town, promises made before God and territorial law that what they'd built in the desert would endure. When Judge Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, Awanada became legally what she'd already been in practice, Awanada Holston. With all the rights and protections that name could provide, their return to the ranch marked a new chapter in its history. The cabin that had once echoed with loneliness now resonated with two languages, two traditions finding harmony in shared space. Awanada's garden flourished under her careful tending, producing vegetables that sustained them through their first winter as legally married partners. Reed taught her to read English while she taught him Apache words for desert plants, weather patterns, and the subtle communications possible between people who truly understood each other. By spring, their transformed life had attracted attention from unexpected sources. Other mixed couples, white men who'd married Apache, or Mexican women, Indian women who'd chosen white husbands, began seeking advice about legal protection and community acceptance. The Holston Ranch became an informal refuge for relationships that existed outside society's narrow definitions of acceptability. More importantly, Awanada's connections within surviving Apache communities provided information about relatives who'd been scattered by government relocation policies. 6 months after their wedding, she received word that her sister Nayeli was alive at a school in New Mexico, learning to be civilized but writing secret letters in Apache to maintain connection with her true identity. Reed didn't hesitate when Awanada asked if they could travel to New Mexico. Not to rescue Nayeli, the girl had chosen adaptation as her survival strategy, but to let her know she wasn't forgotten, that family bonds survived even government attempts to erase them. The reunion was brief but powerful, sisters embracing while Reed stood guard, ready to face whatever consequences might follow from their unauthorized visit. The marriage of Reed and Awanada Holston became a landmark case in territorial law, establishing precedents that protected other interracial unions from legal challenge. Their documented partnership influenced policy discussions about Apache assimilation, demonstrating that integration could occur through voluntary marriage rather than forced relocation. Legal scholars would later cite their case as evidence that love could transcend racial boundaries when protected by careful documentation and community support. More immediately, their ranch became a beacon for others navigating the complex terrain between cultures. Awanada's skills as a healer, knowledge of desert plants and traditional remedies attracted patients from both white and Apache communities. Reed's reputation for fairness made him a trusted arbitrator in disputes between settlers and remaining tribal groups. Together, they created neutral ground where different peoples could interact peacefully. Their economic success challenged assumptions about racial capabilities and partnership benefits. The ranch prospered under their combined management. Awanada's understanding of desert agriculture increased crop yields. Reed's cattle handling expertise expanded their herd. Their joint trading, relationships with both white and Apache communities provided markets for surplus production. Neighboring ranchers who had initially viewed their union with suspicion gradually recognized its practical advantages. The couple's influence extended beyond their immediate area through the network of letters they maintained with scattered Apache families. Awanada's correspondence helped preserve cultural knowledge that government schools were attempting to erase, while Reed's documentation of these communications provided legal protection against charges of sedition or tribal organizing. They became informal guardians of Apache identity in an era when such preservation required careful secrecy. Their love story inspired others who had given up hope of finding acceptance for unconventional relationships. Military veterans who'd married Mexican women during border conflicts, traders who'd taken Indian wives, even white women who'd chosen Apache husbands all found encouragement in the Holston's successful navigation of legal and social obstacles. Their ranch hosted several weddings for couples seeking the same legal protections they'd achieved. Personally, both Reed and Awanada discovered that healing was possible after devastating loss. Reed's nightmares about his first family's death gradually faded, replaced by dreams of the future he was building with Awanada. She learned to trust that not all promises were temporary, that some men honored their commitments regardless of external pressure. Their love proved that second chances could be as profound as first ones when approached with wisdom earned through suffering. The children they eventually raised, 2 sons and a daughter, grew up bilingual and bicultural. Equally comfortable in Apache traditions and frontier society, these children became bridges between communities, translating not just languages, but worldviews, helping their neighbors understand that difference didn't necessarily mean danger. Years later, when territorial status gave way to statehood, the Holston Ranch remained a symbol of what America could become when its highest ideals overcame its deepest prejudices. Visitors would find not a white man who'd civilized an Apache woman, but partners who'd created something entirely new, a family that honored both their histories while building a future neither could have imagined alone. Their legacy lived in the simple truth that love, when protected by law and nurtured by community, could triumph over forces designed to destroy it